Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing Victarion Greyjoy's story in The Winds of Winter and whether or not he will survive Slaver's Bay. This video kind of grew on me George R. R. Martin style and went in a way I didn't expect towards the end. There's a lot of speculatory material. I did have to cut out a lot of the Battle of Fire recap as it bloated the video with too much information. So first I'm going to discuss Victarion's story in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. Then I'm going to get into the theories. Euron wins at Kingsmoot, and Victarion follows him south to the Shield Islands, where Victarion successfully takes them while sustaining a minor hand injury in the battle. After the battle, Victarion disapproves of the treatment of the captives at Lord Hewitt's castle, and then Victarion calls him up to speak with him privately. Victarion is asked by Euron to travel to Slaver's Bay and to bring back Daenerys for Euron to marry. Victarion accepts, although he is actually traveling for another motive, to marry Daenerys for himself as revenge on his brother for sleeping with his third wife. Before he sets off, Victarion is given 3 gifts from his brother, one of them being the Dusky Woman, whom he was given before the battle, another gift being Maester Cerwyn to look after his injured hand, and the final gift is Dragonbinder, a mysterious horn from Valyria that can supposedly bind dragons to the owner's will, although whoever blows it will die. Victarion sets out with 93 ships. Upon arriving at the Stepstones, he has 99. There, he splits the Iron Fleet into 3 equal groups of 33, with orders to regroup at the southern tip of the Isle of Cedars. Victarion and his group travel along the coastline of Essos, arriving at Volantis to restock on supplies. There, Victarion and his crews hear rumors that the Volantene fleet will soon sail to war against Meereen, and he quickly sets out. Traveling around the Valyrian Peninsula, he loses 11 ships to the numerous storms that surround it, and he arrives with 22 ships at the Isle of Cedars. Ralph the Limper is to take his ships and to travel to Lys, where he is to sell the captives that they have into slavery. Victarion disapproves of this, preferring to make his captives thralls for the Iron Fleet. Only 14 of Ralph's ships arrive at the Isle of Cedars. Red Ralph Stonehouse and his swiftest ships are to travel along the Corsairs Road and to gather plunder and supplies at the Basilisk Isles. Only 9 of these ships show up at the Isle of Cedars, and Red Ralph Stonehouse is among the missing. Victarion waits for 9 days upon the Isle of Cedars, gathering supplies, repairing damaged ships, and waiting for stragglers of the fleet to come in. On this 9th day, the Grief arrives, and its captain, the Vole, claims to have a wizard on board who's seen Victarion's death in his fires. The wizard is actually a red priest named Moqorro, whom we see earlier in A Dance with Dragons on Tyrion's chapters. Moqorro tells Victarion he will die, and his captains are dismissive, wanting to kill him. Moqorro stands there, unmoved, and Victarion thinks about killing him, although the pain in his hand is too much, and he brings Moqorro into his cabin. There, Moqorro tells him he is a slave to his brother, and then he heals him using magic. Victarion leaves the cabin with a burnt smoking hand and orders Maester Cerwyn to be killed, as they will get favorable winds all the way to Meereen. 53 ships of the Iron Fleet leave the Isle of Cedars, with 1 ship, the Shark, staying behind to alert stragglers where Victarion is going. At this point, I believe the loyalty of the Iron Fleet is leaning heavily towards Victarion and not Euron. This will be important later on, but the facts we have are, we know that the sailors are unsure of this location in Meereen. They don't really like traveling across the world. And Victarion has been Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet since the Greyjoy Rebellion, and Euron has been missing all this time. I believe if Victarion wins a major battle, he will win the Iron Fleet entirely to him. On the way to Meereen, Victarion is now converted to be a follower of 2 gods, not 1. He now follows the Red God and the Drowned God, and uses Moqorro for help in finding ships to plunder and lost ships. Upon finding 3 of his lost ships at the Straits of Yaros, Victarion wonders if he should travel through the strait and risk being ambushed like he was during the Greyjoy Rebellion, or travel around and waste precious time. He decides to travel through and captures 3 more ships, arriving at close to Meereen with around 61 ships. I'm going to quickly go over some facts about Meereen before we get into the content of the Winds of Winter sample chapters. The first fact is that Groleo was killed by the Yunkish army. This will be more important later. He was the Admiral of Meereen. The next fact I have to get into is there is 20 ships in the bay and about 7 up the Skazadon. This is going to be the main force that Victarion's Ironborn are going to be fighting. And the final fact is that the Windblown and the Second Sons are about to turn their cloaks on the Yunkish army, and we'll see this in the battle. With all that information laid out, I'm going to get into the Winds of Winter sample chapters now. The main part of Victarion's plan is pretty simple. He is sending Wolf One-Ear and 17 of his captured ships, along with his best fighting men, into the Yunkish blockade, where they are to draw them in and then board and seize the ships. He wants as many of the ships to be captured for the trip home. Another part of the plan seems to be blocking the mouth of the Skahazadon with a ship on fire, kind of similar to the Battle of the Blackwater. He also plans to land troops behind the Yunkish camp. This is a huge help for Barristan, as we see in his chapters. We also know that he plans to sound Dragonbinder using the 3 thralls. I believe this is the most dangerous part of Victarion's plan for Victarion himself, and we'll get into what I think is going to happen, but I believe the dragon he will encounter will be Rhaegal, as we see him circling the bay in Tyrion's chapter. Now I'm going to get into the 3 major outcomes of Dragonbinder being sounded. The first outcome, and one I believe to be less likely to happen, is that the dragons are bound to Euron's will. The main reason why I don't think this will happen is Moqorro is very anti-Euron, and I don't think he's going to allow Victarion and his men to blow a horn that will basically give the enemy of R'hllor a dragon. I think even though that Euron is doing a major blood sacrifice in Old Town right now, I think that is more to summon krakens and less about a dragon binding ceremony. The second major outcome is that the horn has no effect on Dany's dragons. I think this is more likely as it's a subversion of expectations. I think that the most that Dragonbinder will do is piss off Rhaegal and maybe cause Rhaegal to try and attack Victarion and the Iron Victory. As we know, the sound of Dragonbinder is very unsettling, which could make Rhaegal angry. I do think Victarion would be protected by Moqorro, and this whole dragon burning situation kind of is foreshadowed in Victarion's description of Dragonbinder's sound. The third and final outcome is Victarion successfully binding a dragon to his will. I think this is the least likely, as Euron wouldn't just give him a working dragon horn with no strings attached, and it would be way too easy of an outcome for him, as all of Euron's gifts are poisoned. There's this whole setup of some incoming danger for Victarion. I do think if it did happen, it would sort of make sense, as we know that the dragon has 3 heads and there must be 2 other dragon riders. As Dany says, only one person may bind with one dragon at a time. I do think there is some credence to the fact that Victarion may ride a dragon at some point or claim one, but this early on in the story, I think it would be such an easy resolution of the whole mysterious Dragonbinder plot and the poison gifts from Euron kind of theme that we have. I do think a fun outcome to add in would be Dragonbinder binding a dragon from a shy, one of these wild ones that we kind of hear about. Really, the only information we have on them is from Bran's chapter, and it's kind of unknown if this is actually true, as Bran sees dragons straying beneath the sunrise in a shy. The outcome I'm going to go with is that neither group is able to claim a dragon, as the horn hasn't been claimed with enough blood magic. And I think that since we know the horn makes a pretty horrific noise that is going to piss off Rhaegal, and Rhaegal is going to try and burn the Iron Victory, I believe in this scenario Moqorro would protect Victarion, and I'll get into all my reasons why, but I believe he'll use some sort of fire magic, as we know he's a very powerful red priest. I'm going to get into my reasons why I think Moqorro needing Victarion for a deeper purpose is not entirely out of the blue. The first reason I believe Victarion will survive is because we have a plotline that is very similar to his. It is a parallel. It is Quentyn's story in A Dance with Dragons. This is a suitor traveling across the world to marry Dany, only to be killed after he tries to claim one of her dragons, specifically Rhaegal. I don't think that George is going to give us the exact same plotline again, especially for a storyline that started in A Feast for Crows and is now all the way in The Winds of Winter. I believe that Victarion isn't a hero. He's more of a villain, and I think Quentin's story was more of a parody on the hero's journey, or a reversal of that. The second reason is more in depth on Moqorro's backstory. So Moqorro is the right hand of Benyero, and we saw Benyero in Tyrion's chapter. He believes Daenerys is the Azor Ahai, and he said Daenerys was in danger. Now, I believe that he's not talking about the Yunkish coalition that is about to attack Dany. I think he's referencing Euron trying to marry Dany. My evidence for this is that when Moqorro is speaking about the shadows after Daenerys that he sees in his fire, the most dangerous or the most chief one is a one-eyed kraken sailing on a sea of blood. This is obviously Euron, as we see in The Forsaken. We know from the Vol's remarks that Moqorro had been at least seeing Victarion's journey in his flames aboard the Celesti Coran, as he knows that Victarion is traveling to the Isle of Cedars, and he knows Victarion is in danger. He also tells Victarion the first time he meets him that he is a slave to his brother, and I don't believe if Victarion was a means to an end, he would even bother telling him this information. He also wouldn't bother trying to convert Victarion, which he does multiple times in his chapter in A Dance with Dragons. He tells him that the drowned god is a demon and that he is a servant of the Great Other. We know that Aeron Damphair tells Victarion he's the only one strong enough to beat Euron. I believe Benyero and Moqorro believe something similar to this, as they've invested a lot of time and energy into protecting Victarion and trying to convert him, as we've seen before. Another reason why I believe Moqorro would protect Victarion is that the Iron Fleet is almost exclusively loyal to him, as I've stated earlier, and they have no reason to stay around in Meereen or Slaver's Bay or to follow Dany if not for Victarion. Victarion obviously wants to marry Dany, and that's the only reason they are still there. If somebody else was to come into power, like Ralph the Limper or Wolf One Ear, they would leave and go back to Westeros, which is not part of Moqorro's plan to have a large fleet for Dany. My final reason is the conspicuously open position of Admiral in Dany's navy. Groleo was her admiral, but he was murdered by the Yunkish coalition as he was a captive of them. George R. Martin could have chosen any one of these semi-unimportant captives to kill. He had somebody like Hero or any of Hizdar's relatives to just kill off, but he chose to kill Groleo, and I believe that was so that the position could be open for when Victarion arrived. We know Victarion is a pretty skilled naval strategist, and there is the Volantene fleet that is coming up, and they need a strong navy, and that is where Victarion comes in. Due to his major part in the Battle of Fire and the victory for Meereen, I believe Victarion will be made Admiral of Meereen, and his most important duty will be ensuring the defeat of the Volantene fleet. The battle with the Volantene fleet, there's a lot of factors at play here. I'm going to try and get into as many as possible. I don't want to over-explain and kind of bloat the video. I had to cut out the Battle of Fire mostly because it was just taking up way too much time with all these extra theories and information kind of going on. So really what I'm looking at is we know that there's all these storms surrounding the Valyrian Peninsula. The Volantene fleet is around 300 strong. We know Victarion's fleet took about 11 losses going around Valyria. Ralph the Limper lost about 19 ships. So we know that there's a pretty good number of ships lost from these storms, and a larger fleet will probably mean more losses. So we could be looking at the Volantene fleet losing about 100. Very positive factor for Victarion here is he captures ships during the Battle of Fire. His whole plan is to capture as many as possible. We know the Ironborn are very good at capturing ships, as they are Viking pirates basically. So I'm assuming with the total fleet size of around like 27 in the bay and 7 in the river, that Victarion is going to be able to capture at least 15 to 20 of these ships. I don't think he's going to get a 100% success rate, although I think he could have if the dragons really weren't an issue. I think the dragons burning ships, especially Rhaegal burning ships in the bay, is going to decrease his numbers quite a bit, but I'm going to put his fleet size at around 80. An important fact about Volantis that I need to get to before we talk about the specifics of the battle is that we know that 4 and 5 of people in Volantis are slaves. We know that the majority of the population follows R'hllor, as well as most of the slaves, so they would not be eager to fight against Daenerys, who Ben Yarrow and Moqorro believe is Azor Ahai. It is highly likely that most of the ships in the Volantene fleet are using slave oarsmen, if not all of them. So that is a major part of their navy that is basically ready to flip to Daenerys if there's a sign of weakness in the Volantene fleet. I also think that there's a slave uprising impending in Volantis itself, and that's all the information I really have on Volantis right now. I'm going to get to the battle at the Straits of Yaros. Now, the most important factor here is the location of this battle that I think is going to happen. Victarion, knowing he's going to have to fight this fleet in a advantageous position, he's going to do what Stannis did to him. This thought is actually very fresh in his mind as we see it in his last chapter in Dance with Dragons, the Straits of Yaros. He had to go through the straits even though he thought he could be ambushed because he was pressed for time because of the delay from waiting on the Isle of Cedars. I believe the Volantene fleet is going to be pressed for time as well, as the storms delayed them, and they have to regroup their whole fleet as well. So we are going to see the Volantene fleet pass through the Straits of Yaros, and Victarion will execute his plan to surround their fleet. Maybe we see Moqorro use some sort of magic, kind of like how Melisandre burnt Orell during the battle beneath the wall. I think all these signs point to Victarion winning in the Straits of Yaros and capturing a large amount of the Volantene fleet, which will help Dany in her trip back to Westeros. Now I'm going to talk about the possible redemption arc that Victarion may go through in the Winds of Winter and his long foreshadowed battle with his brother Euron that I believe is going to happen. With all that said, I believe Victarion is going to convert to follow the Red God after some sort of major act, magical act by Moqorro, perhaps shielding him from fire from Rhaegal, or using some sort of magic to fish him out of the water if he falls into the water. But we know Victarion is already converted from following solely the Drowned God to following both the Drowned God and the Red God. And we know he puts more faith in physical things. He puts his faith in steel. So if there's a very physical manifestation of the Red God besides his burning, smoking hand that he already has, like Moqorro protecting him from dragonfire, saving his life, I believe he will fully convert over to the Red God. I think with this conversion, we may see Victarion shift to be a more neutral character from the lawful evil character he is now. There is a few hints in the text that Victarion may shift to be a more neutral style character and less of an evil one as we've seen him to be. We do see Victarion disapprove of how Euron treats Lord Hewitt's wife and daughters at his castle after they are taken captive. We see him disapprove of the slave trade. He prefers the Ironborn style of taking thralls and salt wives. We also see him free the slaves from Yunkish galleys and makes them oarsmen in his fleet, which according to him, the oarsmen in the Iron Fleet are a high honor position. We also know that Victarion's most evil action, at least according to most people, is him killing his wife. He does this with tears in his eyes, and it is only because she cheated on him with Euron. I'm not defending Victarion by any means. I'm just going to compare this with somebody like Jaime Lannister, who pushed Bran Stark out a window to cover up his affair with Cersei, his twin sister. He also implies that he would have killed Arya if he had found her first at the inn at the crossroads with the whole Nymeria incident. We can also compare the sacrifices to R'hllor that Victarion makes with somebody like Stannis, who's also beloved by fans. We also know that Stannis is responsible for his younger brother Renly's death at the hands of a shadow assassin. So I am obviously not defending Victarion by any means, but I am just trying to frame his character in a way that we can see that there is a possibility for redemption for him, as both of those characters I listed have done is equally as bad things as Victarion, and yet they are looked at in a more favorable light than Victarion is. We know that Dany would probably accept a more neutral Victarion more readily. I do actually believe Victarion does have a chance to marry Dany, and it stems from the fact there's a lot of parallels between Khal Drogo and Victarion. I'll get into that in 1 second. We do see that Dany's marriages are more utility based. When Viserys made her marry Khal Drogo, it was for his Khalasar and his army to invade Westeros. She married Hisdar for peace and Meereen to stop the Sons of the Harpy, and she may marry Victarion to bind the Iron Fleet, which, as I'm thinking, it's going to be very huge by the time Dany gets back to Meereen, to her. This is all just speculation at this point, but there is some parallels in the text between Victarion and Drogo, her first husband, who she came to love. Drogo is a dullard, brute, conqueror style from a warlike culture. All of those words describe Victarion. Obviously, I kind of got into the whole utility marriage. That's the same thing here. They even have the whole festering wound situation where Victarion had the wound on his hand and Drogo had one on his chest. Obviously, Victarion survived his and Drogo ended up dying as a result of his. That's really all I have to say on that. I'm going to get into the topic of Euron and Victarion now. I think the shift towards a more neutral Victarion and less evil will juxtapose perfectly with his brother Euron being more and more evil as the Winds of Winter goes on. I think Victarion and Euron will be featured a lot during the Winds of Winter, and I believe there's a kind of Song of Ice and Fire between them. We already see Euron being associated with the color blue. We know that Melisandre calls the Great Other the Soul of Ice, and he's associated with the cold and death and dying. And as we see in the Forsaken chapter, there's a lot of demonic and evil imagery, if you will, associated with Euron. Meanwhile, Victarion, he is kind of on this path to following R'hllor, as I've laid out, and I think he's got the smoking burnt hand. He's associated with dragons. R'hllor, he's the fire. Euron is the ice, and I think they will have some sort of ultimate conflict during the end of the Winds of Winter, and this is where Victarion or Euron both die. So in conclusion, I believe Victarion will survive the immediate battles during Slaver's Bay. First, the Battle of Fire, and then the battle with the Volantene fleet. I think he's going to survive long enough to get back to Westeros to actually fight his brother Euron, which will be an awesome moment. As it is known in the fandom, it is called Kraken Bowl. I want to give thanks to everyone who's watched the entire video, and I want you guys to give me your opinion on what you thought. If you liked my theory, if you didn't, if you thought my reasoning was a little shaky, please let me know. I try and do a ton of research for these videos. Make sure you leave a comment and drop a like, and thank you guys for watching.